Now, I bet you've seen videos where contrast is taught like this, or where hierarchy is shown something like this. But not in this graphic design course, because we're going to show you how to use the principles on actual designs and in the most efficient and professional way possible. And in this course, we will do that in regard to 4 different design principles, and there'll be more to come in the future. The concept or design principle of balance isn't just about symmetry, but also refers to the weight of a design. On a graphic design, balance can be achieved through size, color, boldness, and placement. Now check this design right here. At a first glance, you might consider that it's a pretty cool design, but you might miss the crazy amount of balance that is actually being used here. So let's truly unpack balance on this design and see how it actually works. The most obvious way balance has been used on this design is on the 4 images. The designer has used asymmetrical balance by having 1 large image and then 3 smaller images, and that's to run with the Kodak kind of layout. But this works so well because it creates interest and intrigue on the design. Just imagine if the design used all 4 images in the same size. Now I doubt the design would have much of an impact or a punch if it did use the 4 same size. Asymmetrical balance often suits dynamic or unconventional music genres, which this design is aimed at. Then consider color. The design has a balanced color palette that works in harmony. We see purples, pinks, and blues throughout the design, and these colors are actually found in the same area of the color wheel, which is color harmony. These are then accented with black across the design. There are no jarring contrasts of, say, yellows or greens, and that's simply because the designer wanted a harmonic balance on the design in terms of color. But also consider the main image. A large percentage of the image is in grayscale or black and white. And again, that is balance, because I'm sure if the image was in full color, the design would likely look too vibrant and a bit jarring. The vibe of the design here is subtle and soft, and the balance of color helps to enforce that. The main typography could have been laid out over an image or over other design elements, but it's actually been given its own area of white or negative space, and that's so it can easily be read and thus creating more harmony between imagery and text. Also, if you look at the lower section on the design, we even see asymmetrical balance in terms of the size of the typography in comparison to the colored square and logos to the right. The text takes up a large majority of this space, and again making it more emphasized in this area. And finally, there is balance of texture where we see a large degree of texture in the imagery and also on the edges of the design. But then we have a very flat and a very bold nature in the typography itself. The typography would likely become lost if it carried the same texture and color as other parts of the design. Take this design here and pause the video if you must, but try and see how many areas of balance you can detect within a single design. And that's while considering what we've just discussed in regard to balance. We'll come back to this later. Now it's time to look closely and deeply into contrast. Now contrast isn't just about colors being vastly different or opposite to each other on the color wheel. It's about creating a wide range of differences to emphasize certain design elements. This can be achieved through variations in color, size, shape, texture, and a lot more. So we're going to take this bland, this boring, this ineffective website design for a travel brand and turn it into something a business can actually use. So the first thing I want to do is to focus on contrast of the typography in the main heading. Yes, the subheading is slightly smaller and less bold, but the contrast isn't enough in my opinion. Also, importantly, I feel like there's not enough contrast with the find a trip bar seen here. The aim of contrast is to make something stand out, and with the typography being so elongated here, it mimics the bar shape. So we can change the typography to something like this. And you might notice now there is a lot of white space over to the right. We'll soon get to that, don't worry. But the background of this heading is sort of a dull blue, and don't get me wrong, it's quite a nice blue. But to create contrast of style and texture, let's add an actual image in this section. Now can you see how, yes, before we had contrast of the dark blue and the light blue, and that broke up the website into sections. But the image and the texture of the image has such a vastly different impact. Now the website just hits different. And we could always have an actual image like this here too, but to me, I prefer having the contrast of one image and then a block color. Now, I want to focus on this lady in a summer hat. At the moment, the image is framed in a rectangle with rounded corners. Now this matches other elements on the design, which is completely fine if you're going for consistency. But I want to stand out, I want to use contrast, and I want it to be slightly different, and so having a circular frame does add a little bit of intrigue to this part of the design. So we have the website broken up into different sections, and contrast has been used to emphasize certain aspects and make the design look a bit more engaging. But there's one thing left to do, something pretty important. We need to make that call to action stand out and get some clicks. Now studies show that simply having a contrasting color on the CTA can dramatically increase its clickability, and that matters a whole lot to brands and businesses. So yeah, just a few changes in regard to contrast and things are drastically different. Now it's time to look at repetition, and no, we're not just looking at ways to make consistency and then show you a group of circles with the same color. Now that's not graphic design. Instead, here's the Apple logo. When we're talking about repetition, it can be used on a single design, or across an entire set of designs, or in this case of Apple here, across the entire brand. Repetition mainly comes down to 5 things: color palette, typography, shape, layout, and graphics. However, in terms of branding, we can actually add the use of a logo and also package design into that list. For example, take a look at Apple's package designs. It uses the same white background layout with similar imagery, the same font and typography layout, and the logo is often positioned in similar ways and locations. Now you might say to yourself, well, big deal. Actually, it's simple, yes, but it's hugely powerful to designers and to brands. You yourself would know you have an Apple product in your hand if we remove the logo from the packaging, and that's because of the packaging design itself. It's the feel of it and how you've been conditioned over time with repetition on the packaging. Now, just look at this example of a marketing design for Apple. It's obviously for Apple, right? I mean, we have the white background, the minimal sharp imagery, the font, and so on. But let's change all of that. Maybe have a gradient colored background. We can use a bunch of different people with their smartphones instead of just one person. And we can change the text to white and also change the font to something else and use a different layout and size. We can actually keep the Apple logo if we want to, but does the advert now scream Apple to you? Probably not, and that's because we have strayed away from design consistency, which is something repetition helps enforce. This is a website design for a tattoo studio, and this design is such a great example of how repetition should be used within a graphic design. And after we look over this design, I have a quick and a fun thought experiment based on the design. So let's get into it. So at the very top of this Behance presentation, what do we see? It's the things I've just spoken about in relation to repetition in regard to Apple. It's the logo, the color palettes, the typography, and the graphics. I've never heard of the typeface Macbeth, but we'll soon see its relevancy on this website. So scrolling down the homepage, yes, we see the logo pretty large here, but also notice the repetition of a circle off to the right. Also, if you've got a trained eye for design, you'll notice that there's a chat button here, and that could have been square, but the designer has opted for a rounded button which carries on the repetition of shape, and that breeds consistency. Scrolling down again, we notice the color scheme is obviously repeated, and we have more circular shape repetition too. But take a look here. Notice the style and texture of the icon graphics. It's that kind of sketchy, chalky effect, and this is repeated on that typeface Macbeth. And this isn't by mistake, it just shows how competent this graphic designer is and how much they're going for repetition. And again here on the skull icon, the same sketchy texture and style, which we also see off to the right with more repeated graphics. But one touch I really like and admire of this design is the arrow on the back to the top button. It has that same sketchy style, and I think this is a really cool touch. But down here, these images could have been square style, maybe even rectangle. But again, the designer is smart and they made use of repetition to achieve what exactly? Yep, consistency. That continues with the Book Now buttons below in shape and also color. But this website applies a great deal of repetition also in terms of layout and the amount of white space on the design itself. But in general, the consistency or repetition level of this design is really up there at the top. But what about that thought experiment? So for a moment, close your eyes and just think about that tattoo studio website we've just looked at. Is it memorable to you? Do you have a strong memory of the color scheme, the vibe, the layout, and so on? Maybe you've just got a strong memory of white, yellow, and black. Well, if you have any of these spring to mind when you close your eyes, the graphic designer has achieved their goal on this website. Repetition is used for consistency, but that leads on to memorability, recognition, and also accessibility to the audience. So we're now going to look at a graphic design principle that isn't taught that much on YouTube and online, but it's actually quite important. Movement and flow is essential on almost every single graphic design, some more than others. Without proper use of movement and flow, your design will be confusing to audiences and they won't be able to get the message effectively or navigate across your design. And so basically, your design will end up being pretty useless. And that's not good for your client or for you. Interestingly, this is something AI can't actually comprehend at the moment, so let's take a look at it. There are many ways that designers can apply movement and flow onto their designs. And the first method we're going to look at here is directional line or directional design elements. The use of diagonal lines, curves, or other design elements can guide the viewer's eye through the design, and this creates a sense of movement and also direction. On this design, notice how from the top right, the body of the subject gradually moves into the center and then down to the bottom left. But if you've also got a keen eye for design, you'll notice how the typography of Genji is slanted in the exact same direction or the movement of the design. And this simply complements the flow of the design. Even the sword moves along this directional plane. The flow or the movement here is of a slight diagonal from top right to bottom left, and that's mainly because of the shape of the document itself. Notice how narrow and tall it actually is. But if we bring up this design here, consider the shape of the document and then consider the movement or the flow of the design on it. And by the way, I absolutely love this style of graphic design. I could pretty much look at it for hours and hours. But anyway, this canvas or document is more square than the previous design, and so the designer has adopted a different sense of movement and flow in regard to the directional assets. We see typography behind the focal point kind of trailing horizontally, and that is matched with the head literally gazing in the same direction. And then we see other typography elements also communicate that horizontal style too. So yeah, basically, a lot of the movement and flow on a graphic design should initially be dictated by the kind of dimensions of the document you're working on. But then here, we can see movement and flow being used in a slightly different way. A lot of movement and flow is created via the white space, among other principles. And on this design, we start off with a radial balance and a focal point of the moon. The white space around the main content allows for the viewer to then move on to the next thing, and at the very bottom here we have an expanse of darkness which kind of draws us in. There's a really neat laid out set of information here which has nice amounts of macro and micro white space around it, and that allows the viewer to easily absorb the information and then move on to the next thing when they're finished. And this is where more principles blend into movement and flow, because proximity has been used to group everything on the left into one section, and then everything on the right as a different section. Again, a nice amount of white space around it so the audience or the viewer can navigate it pretty easily. Now, this next thing is pretty clever. Most speakers of English read from left to right, and so we finish with the bright graphic on the right, and then move diagonally down to the left where another bright graphic is. The designer has used emphasis in brightness to usher us in this way. And after we've read or dealt with the information, we finally move down to the finishing point here. So as you can probably see, when it comes to movement and flow, we actually incorporate a lot of different graphic design principles in unison with movement and flow. And this helps guide the audience around your graphic designs, and we can usher them where we want them to go on our designs. So now we're going to return back to the design that we briefly looked at the first section of this course on balance. I asked you to try and determine what aspects of this design incorporate balance, and I'm actually going to venture into why as well. So in case you haven't already realized, when it comes to using graphic design principles on a design, they kind of merge into one another and they kind of work in unison together. And when it comes to balance, one of the principles that heavily ties into it is contrast. But I digress. The first form of balance on this design is something known as radial balance. It's the third aspect of symmetry where most of the content is in the middle and we see white space around the edges. This creates a sense of harmony by distributing visual weight evenly in all directions from the central point. And that makes the design feel unified and it draws us into the focal point. But one way balance coincides with contrast is by using contrasting elements such as light and dark, large and small, bold and subtle. On this design, we see the main focal point of the person being of a photo in black and white, and that's contrasted with graphic, hand-drawn style typography and color. This contrast of design elements creates balance and adds intrigue to the design. There is also balance of texture here, as we can see the paper effect along the design, and again, that's balanced with the photographic style of the person. The colors are also balanced nicely as to not create a strong visual dominance by one single color taking over the whole design. Balance can be used in a way to create harmony, or it can be used to create disharmony when you want to emphasize something. It really depends what you want to do or what you need to do on your design. But if you'd like to learn some more useful graphic design content in this kind of course style video, just click a video on screen. But until next time guys, design your future today. Peace.